Professors FM.
I'm Bridget Stomberg.
And I'm Lisa D. Simone.
And this is Taxes for the Masses.
Today's episode welcomes Scott Hodge from the Tax Foundation to discuss his new book, Taxocracy.
If you are listening to this podcast, you are probably curious about and perhaps fascinated by how seemingly well-intentioned tax policies can actually harm people, businesses, and the economy. In today's episode, we welcome tax expert Scott Hodge to discuss his new book, Taxocracy, What You Don't Know About Taxes and How They Rule Your Daily Life. The book provides digestible and entertaining examples of tax policies gone awry.
Hello, B.
Hello, Lisa.
I think we're both pretty excited about today's episode.
I think we are. So today we're going to be joined by Scott Hodge. He is the former president of the Tax Foundation, and he's also a senior policy advisor.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about Scott's impressive and extensive experience working with tax policy in the U.S. in a bit. But I want to start by understanding why you personally are excited to have Scott as our guest today.
Absolutely, sure thing. So you know this, and I think we mentioned it a lot on this podcast, so our readers probably know it. But the Tax Foundation is one of my go-to resources whenever we're putting an episode together, researching a topic.
Yep.
And it's because they present really digestible information about tax policy. Mm-hmm. I think their pieces are thoughtful. They are most of the time written in plain English. And, because of that, we cite them on the podcast quite a bit. I just think that they're kind of trying to do what we're trying to do too. They're writing to an audience of not economists and not tax experts to try to get them to understand tax policy. So that's why I'm excited. Why are you excited to have Scott as our guest?
Well, I'll start by seconding everything you just said. Totally agree. In addition to that, when I got a hold of this book, and I read it in 2 days.
Yes.
It's not a hard read, but also it was compelling in the sense I kept wanting to turn the page and see what else he was talking about. And what was so cool is he talks about many, 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 many of the topics that we talk about on the pod.
Yes.
And it was really cool to not only to see that somebody else is kind of zeroing in on these same issues that we find really interesting, but to get a slightly different perspective from this person who has worked for a long time with the Tax Foundation.
You are 100% right about that. And I think what you're saying is what I'm about to say here. It was almost validating.
Yeah.
Right. To see so much of the overlap, because, sometimes I know that you and I are off on our own universe in a lot of ways. But, sometimes I do wonder if we're just kind of off in space in terms of what we think is interesting and important for this podcast. Mm-hmm. So it really was nice to see a really seasoned, experienced tax policy expert highlighting many of the same topics that we have, thinking that they are really interesting and illustrative things to talk about if you want to talk about and understand tax policy more broadly.
Yeah, and it really highlighted the point, too, that different sides, like different political leanings, can view very similar topics actually pretty similarly.
Yes.
Like there was a lot of common ground. I'm not going to say that I agreed with everything in the book, like all of the perspectives that were shared, but by and large, there was a lot of common ground, which I found not only validating, but a little bit surprising.
Absolutely.
All right. So the plan for today is to start with some discussion from the book related to topics we've covered in this podcast. We're basically trying to whet your appetite, dear listeners, to go read that book. And then we'll welcome Scott himself on to learn more about his experience in general and his experience writing the book. Sound like a plan?
It does. So can I start?
Yeah, go for it.
So my favorite chapter of the book was chapter 5, which is about musicians selling their music catalogs instead of collecting royalties.
Oh, that sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar. It's a topic we discussed in March of 2024. So to recap, if you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode, we talk about the fact that if music artists retain their catalog of songs, they can earn royalties when their music is either streamed or sampled. And in that case, that royalty income that they earn is going to be taxed at a top rate in the US right now, which is 37%. Mm-hmm. But instead, if they sort of turn that annuity stream of royalty income into a lump sum payment by selling their music catalog, oftentimes to a private equity firm, that gain that they realize is going to be taxed at an all-in top rate of only about 24%. And so that 13 percentage point discrepancy, some people think, is leading some musicians to sell their music catalogs rather than hold on to them. And so that might be one possible explanation for the recent uptick we've seen in music catalog sales in the past couple of years.
Yeah, and in his book, Taxocracy, Scott highlights 2 additional related reasons for this trend that we've seen. So first has to do with President Biden. After he was elected in 2020, he vowed to tax capital gains at ordinary income rates for people earning over $1 million. So we could have seen a spike in music catalog sales after Biden made that promise because they were trying to get in under the gun before that change happened. And this relates to the timing strategy of tax planning that we've talked about on episodes in the past.
Yeah, so this is kind of a double whammy. Not only can you get that lower rate because it's capital gains income, if you did it quickly before Biden raised it, you could have gotten an even lower rate on the capital gains.
Right.
Second thing he raised, because you said there were 2 things, is that by selling their music catalogs during their lifetime while they are alive, artists potentially save their heirs the hassle of having to value the catalog as part of their estate. And then subsequently pay taxes on the value of their catalog as part of their estate. So in the book, Scott tells the story of how it took 6 years for the IRS and the heirs of Prince's estate to agree on the value of his intangible assets that he left behind when he died. So if you give it away during your lifetime, you know what the cost is, you know what the value is, you pay taxes on it, you don't have to deal with that at death.
And all of these music catalog sales that were spawned by these tax considerations, or at least partially motivated by taxes, they're all a great illustration of one of the main points that Scott wants to drive home in his book, which is that tax policies can have really far-reaching and perhaps unexpected consequences. So we are witnessing private equity firms snatching up music catalogs, reshaping the music industry as we know it, at least in part due to these tax incentives.
It is pretty cool. So very shortly after you and I recorded that episode, the New York Times ran an opinion piece by Mark Hogan. He's a reporter, a music critic, and he was basically lamenting the fact that private equity firms are gobbling up all these music catalog sales because now it's their asset. They want to promote that asset. They want to get that asset to generate the most income that it can. So they're really pushing this older music that they own the rights to. And what they're doing is essentially crowding out newer artists. And by Hogan's assessment, that's resulting in a blander music scene. Again, all at least partially maybe because of taxes. It's kind of cool.
It's super cool. I mean, it's not great, but it's cool.
It's cool. Today, we welcome Scott Hodge to the podcast. Scott is a tax policy expert. He served for over 20 years as the president and CEO of the Tax Foundation, an international research think tank based in Washington, D.C. He is now president emeritus and senior policy advisor at the Tax Foundation. Scott has appeared in over 1,000 media interviews, written published essays in many top business outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, and has advised politicians on the very tax topics that he addresses in his new book, Taxocracy. Scott, welcome to Taxes for the Masses.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight.
Just to get us started, I think it would be very helpful if you tell us a little bit about your background. And I think we're particularly interested because many of our listeners, maybe not voluntarily, but many of our listeners are college students in our classes. And I think they're always really interested in how people come to love taxes because it's not always obvious to a 19, 20-year-old why taxes are really, stimulating career. So could you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in taxes, how you became a tax expert? And then I'm particularly interested in hearing about your time as president of the Tax Foundation.
Well, thank you. I would say that I'm kind of an accidental tax expert, and I put quotes around the expert side of it. I actually started out in the early 1980s, more interested in free market economics and how the market can solve government problems. In particular, back then, privatization was a big topic in political science and economics. How we can use free market solutions like privatization, like contracting out, competition, to solve local government problems. And I got so interested in it, I helped start a local think tank in Chicago called the Heartland Institute, which was kind of a libertarian group. But the idea was to study local government issues and find free market solutions.
Very cool.
Flash forward, I came to Washington, worked at a think tank here called the Heritage Foundation, which many of you may have heard of, and studied the spending side of the budget for about a decade there, and then was recruited to come over to the Tax Foundation in 2000. So I've kind of made this journey along the way from different sides of fiscal policy, starting on the budget side and now on the tax side. And yeah, I started with the Tax Foundation in 2000, and I think that right now, Tax Foundation really is one of the premier tax organizations in Washington, and our specialty is looking at the economics of tax policy.
What made you decide to write the book, and how did you get the idea to frame it in the way that you did? It's almost like every chapter you take sort of an understandable, a relatable, illustrative example to then go in and explain a tax policy and maybe a failure of a tax policy or a success of a tax policy. So just talk a little bit, if you would, about your decision to write the book and your process to set it up in the way that you did.
Growing up, as I have career-wise in the think tank business, other economists are not our audience. Our audience are average taxpayers, average citizens, voters, as well as journalists and even members of Congress, who are sometimes, let's put it mildly, the hardest ones to educate on tax policy. So you got to find ways to reach people in a way that they can understand, and I've always felt that stories do that. Supply and demand curves don't speak to average people. They don't speak to me very well either. I tend to remember stories and anecdotes. And as I started giving lectures to high school students, and I started trying to find stories that would speak to them. So I created a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation with simple pictures on it. So it was a picture of a chicken next to a delivery van, a Hershey bar next to a Twix bar, buildings in Paris with the mansard roofs, buildings in Amsterdam with thin buildings. All of those told a story about how tax policy influenced those things. And from that, I just started developing this interest in telling those stories in book form. And that became the real genesis of the book, and it grew from there.
There's a line in the introduction of the book, which I really enjoyed reading, by the way, the entire book. But there was a line in particular that really caught our interest. You say taxes are as much about psychology as they are about economics.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more about that, and maybe give another example that you think highlights that?
They change the way we think and approach things. I think my favorite chapter of the book is chapter 11, in which it's about the estate tax. And there was this gentleman who had terminal disease, and he woke up every morning at the end of 2009 saying, "What day is it? Is it January 1st yet?" He was actually willing himself to live into 2010 because the estate tax was going to be repealed for one single year. And in 2009, the estate tax rate was 45%. The year after, in 2011, the estate tax rate was going to go to 55%. So I hate to say it, but if you're going to die, 2010 was the year to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so he willed himself to live to that year. At the same time, there was another gentleman, wealthy gentleman, who asked his lawyer, if I go to Holland, where euthanasia is legal, and I undergo euthanasia, will it still absolve my estate tax? And he said yes. So if people are willing to go to those extents to avoid taxation, what else would they do? We often talk about taxes as being, taxes and death are the one constants in life, but those are two examples that I think really tell that tale.
Very starkly.
Yes.
So your book and those examples that you've just shared with us right now do a really wonderful job of highlighting that taxes do, in fact, change people's behavior. We are in 2024. This is an election year, and you have a line in the book that also says politicians never stop using the tax code to influence our behavior. So question for you, because you've done a lot of interacting with politicians and consulting politicians, why do you think that taxes are such a popular talking point for politicians? Maybe it's just because of my background, but anytime they mention tax, my ears perk up and I listen to it. And it's like you said, many times they try to explain things in maybe overly simplistic ways or overly optimistic ways. So why do you think it, because when you think about the general public, like you said, not everybody loves taxes, and you sort of have to tell stories to get people interested. So why do you think it is that something that, people generally wouldn't be that interested in becomes such a central talking point during elections?
Well, you think of the way politicians think. They have two sort of tools that they can use to try to influence policy or the economy. They have the spending side of the budget, which obviously some politicians like to spend more than others, but the spending side is harder. It's a difficult thing to kind of change people's behavior or to influence certain sectors of the economy. Tax policy, on the other hand, I think a lot of members of Congress or politicians understand. At the local level, let's see, we want to reduce the amount of smoking. We're going to raise the cigarette tax.
Yep.
We want to reduce the consumption of sweetened beverages. We have a sweetened beverage tax. And so there's this intuitive understanding that we can change behavior through those kind of things. And then they think, well, we want to reduce the amount of wealth in society. Let's have a wealth tax, because that will incentivize or reduce the amount of wealth. And we can use that for redistribution or paying for other programs and so forth. And I think members of Congress do understand that. They have a sort of an intuition. Now, often that intuition is wrong. And they don't take the next step and say, oh, what's the unintended consequences of this, right?
Exactly.
What if we tax these people? What's going to happen? Well, if we raise the soda tax, guess what? People are going to go from our community to another community to buy their soda. And that's going to hurt our grocery stores and our 7-Elevens and so forth. And we've seen that in city after city where, advocates will say, look, if the consumption of soda went down in our community, isn't that great? Well, the actual purchases of soda went up in neighboring communities. And so you have to understand how these incentives work.
And I think that's a really important point that you hammer home throughout the book, is the importance of being vigilant about these unintended consequences of tax laws on taxpayers and on the economy more broadly. So I guess if you could, pitch something to our listeners for how to remain ever vigilant, what would your pitch be? What is your advice for how to do that?
Of course, shamefully, I would say go out on Amazon and buy Taxocracy.
Yes. And Step number one. Yep. Step number two, subscribe to this podcast. Okay.
Subscribe to the podcast.
Good.
Yeah. Pay attention. Ask questions.
Yeah.
Ask the next question. Ask what's motivating these policies, and demand that they think beyond the initial effect that the politicians are trying to get, and see if they've thought about these unintended consequences. But analogies are wonderful ways to understand the impact of these things. Find other ways, the impact of other taxes, and how that might influence the way a new tax proposal might work or not work, or the unintended consequences of it as well. So ask questions. Don't take these things on face value, because politicians have one intuition, but it may not be economically sound.
And to your point, we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Like if we've seen this in other jurisdictions or a similar type of sin tax, for example, if we were talking about imposing a new one, we can learn from history.
And I think that's something that's so great about your book, right? What you're saying, yes, if it didn't work the 3 times that we've tried it before, or if it didn't work in the 12 other countries that tried it, explain to me what is different about the
Yes.
construction and the design of this policy that's going to overcome those challenges that we encountered when we tried to do it before in another place. So I think that's a very good point that you're making. We have something that we can learn from history. And your book has all these really great examples that can give people some talking points and things to think about.
And each of the chapters is very short, as you know, and it's only 1,500 words each. And I've tried to wrap up every chapter with 8 or 10 tax takeaways, as I call them.
Yep.
Little nuggets or lessons that we can take away from each chapter, and then use those to apply those later on in the book. These lessons build on each other, and we can understand those lessons from the past and how they affect current tax policy. What we also try to do is not just teach these lessons, but also spend the last third of the book looking at solutions.
Yep.
How do we get to a system, a tax code that doesn't affect our daily lives, that is not only economically neutral, but it's politically neutral too? And there are a couple things that we're going to have to do in order to get to that kind of a system. One is to give up what we call loss aversion, and that is to be willing to give up some of our credits and deductions on the faith that a simpler system is going to be better. Politicians are going to have to learn that the tax code is not always the best tool to change policy and change the economy and engage in social and economic engineering. And then the business community is going to have to learn that the tax department is not a profit center. And unfortunately, a lot of policies today have turned the tax department into a profit center as they're chasing all the new credits, for instance, that are in the Inflation Reduction Act and those kind of things. They're changing their business model to conform to the tax code rather than the other way around. And I think that those are the lessons we need to take away and understand that we need reform, we need a new system, and there's a way to get there if we follow some good economic and tax principles to get there.
This is great. Once again, a plug for the book
Absolutely.
Taxocracy. Scott, thanks so much for being on our show.
Thank you so much.
Well, it's time for the good, the bad, and the ugly, our favorite part of every episode. And the good is pretty easy here, right? Like having guests on the pod is pretty fun.
It is. And if I am allowed to say, this is a situation where Scott reached out to us, which is always lovely that people know that we exist. And
Yes.
that's very validating. But loved it because I think it was a natural fit, right? Sometimes we get requests for episode guests and it's like, I don't know if this is what we're all about. But this is clearly what we're all about, which is trying to do the hard work of making taxes digestible for a broad audience of people. And that's what Scott's book is trying to accomplish.
Quick aside, but what is your favorite, I'm not sure that's what we're about type approach that we get from random people that we don't know?
It's got to be the how to like cheat the IRS out of
100%.
Yes, like you've not listened to a single word that has come out of either one of our mouths if you think that that's what we're about here.
Exactly. So, I agree 100%.
No.
Yes.
Scott knew what was up and reached out, and I think it was a really great fit.
Well, he definitely knows what's up because, he knew it was up with our podcast, but then like in the tax setting too, right? His book is incredibly well informed. It's really easy to read. These are all more good things. I've circled back to the good here, trying to keep us on task, even though I'm the one who got us off task. I recommend reading the book regardless of what side of the political spectrum you're on. I think it's informative and interesting.
And another good thing is that the timing, I think, couldn't be better. As sad as I am that election season is upon us, is upon us.
I picked a really good time to give up the news, by the way.
100%. Yeah. And
So
we know we're already seeing taxes come out because there's lots of differences on, Biden's tax plan versus Trump's tax plan. So there's not going to be any shortage of tax discussion during this campaign cycle. So I think his book is it's great timing for voters who want to understand a little bit more about tax policy. I think it's great.
So now that we're on to the bad of election cycle, yeah, I'm going to let you start because you're Bleak B. So give it to me.
I am. And I think it is, when I first started watching political debates and things like that, I didn't know anything about anything. And so one thing that politicians do well is sound like they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, they do that very well.
Right.
Yes.
So it wasn't until, into my 30s when I sort of felt like I was competent in the area of taxes. And then they would start talking about taxes and it was like, oh my, what? No, oh, wow, really? And then you sort of, it's like the thread gets pulled and you lose faith in the whole thing. So bad that we have to deal with elections anyway, but bad how big of a political bargaining chip taxes and tax policy are. And you and I have had conversations with people that sometimes, politicians will throw out a tax policy or criticize a tax policy and they have no intention of actually seeing it through. It's just something that they say to advance a different agenda. And I don't like that either. So I just don't like how misconstrued things get during political campaigns, how little politicians seem to know about the tax policies that they're proposing. The whole thing is just painful to me.
And how little taxpayers seem to understand about these tax policies and what's being said about them. And I think that was one motivation for you and I to get together periodically and talk about these things to make sure that we understand, but also being in the business of education to try to do our tiny little part to contribute to a more informed electorate.
And I think Scott's point is right on. We can learn something from history. There are a lot of analogies to be drawn. So even if a candidate is proposing a tax policy that seems new, it is highly likely that something similar to it was tried in the past or tried in a different jurisdiction. And if you pick up Scott's book, if you listen to this podcast and you know about that, you can make an informed prediction about how things might turn out if we tried to do something similar again or in the U.S. So the ugly and the big thing that jumps out to me, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this. There's many chapters in the book. It's not a long read. Every chapter is fairly short.
Yeah.
But there are lots of chapters. So he basically just wrote an extensive book on failed tax policies. There's not a lot of shiny examples of, tax success. And that's by design, right? Because a lot of times we can learn best from our mistakes, a little bit better from our mistakes than from our successes. But that is what I just kept reading. Like I would get through a chapter and think, oh, that was really interesting. And then I would think, oh man, that was really dumb.
Yeah. To be fair, he does propose some pretty dramatic tax policies at the end as a potential path forward. I like the idea that he didn't just poop all over everything and say, we're screwed, we can't do anything. He actually tries to propose something, but creating tax policy is hard, right? We know this.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And I think this is a good and a bad maybe. And you alluded to this earlier. It was interesting to me because we didn't ask Scott outright what his political views were, but based on some of the places that he's worked before, I would say that he probably falls a little bit more on the conservative side of the spectrum than you or I do.
Yep.
But I found myself agreeing with a lot of the things that he was saying and a lot of the shortfalls of tax policy that he was identifying. And so I think it's another situation where in the U.S., we're not as divided always as we are told we are by politicians and by the media. But then to your point, sometimes we might agree on the problem, but we don't necessarily agree on the proposed solution.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say is like, I found myself nodding along to, 90% of each chapter. And then when it got to the 10% of, if there was a 10% of what we should do about it or what the takeaway was, I was sort of like, is that the takeaway? Like, is that really the proposed solution? Like, I think exactly what you said, we're going to disagree on the path forward, even if we agree on what happened in the past.
But to end it on a high note, without Scott even putting forth a potential solution, we can't have that discussion. We can't have that debate. So very appreciative of him doing that and of him writing the book and of being a guest on the pod.
He was a great guest. I really enjoyed interacting with him.
Absolutely.
Well, that's all we have time for today.
Be sure to join us for more tax nerdery on future episodes of Taxes for the Masses.